Queen City News honors Black History Month with a look back on our legacy. Historic communities, gentrified, schools, segregated and integrated. The black vote, suppressed and disenfranchised. How do we move our communities forward?
In 25, 30 years, I want them to look back and be proud of the work that we've done right now.
Hear from the leading voices working to reshape our legacy for the future.
Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Julian Sador.
And I'm Janet Parker. For the next hour, we're focusing on legacy. It's been more than 70 years since a black student walked into a previously all-white school. What barriers do CMS students still face today?
And from poll taxes to new photo ID laws, is the black vote still being suppressed?
From the fall of Black Wall Street to gentrification, has new development wiped away Charlotte's historic black communities? A
community like the West End, which was once the place to be for black businesses, churches, schools, and entertainment, until it began to unravel.
Wow, I feel good.
Charlotte's West End,
I knew that I wouldn't.
in its heyday, was a hub for black excellence. And the Excelsior Club was a beacon of that. The great James Brown, just one of many to grace its stage. Nowadays, though, it looks like this, a project under repair by a California developer, a representation of what the West End is seeing as a whole. But to understand how we got here, you first have to understand what happened here.
How would you describe the community at the time?
It was, for me, it was totally nurturing.
Thelma Byers-Bailey recalls moving into Lincoln Heights in the 1940s when she was just in diapers.
I could walk in any house, and in fact, when my parents were still moving into the house, I took off with my blanket and my bottle, and I walked down the street and I knocked on the door and I said, "I'm Peach Byers," and I walked right past them and looked in the refrigerator and just made myself to home.
As she says, it was a time when neighbors felt more like an extended family. Everyone looked after one another. The success of the historically black college, Johnson C. Smith University, had in part resulted in several black neighborhoods, even some middle-class ones, thriving up and down Beatties Ford Road.
So it's sort of like the suburban American dream that you hear about so much in the 50s, but this is an African-American neighborhood.
Brandon Lunsford is the director of library services at JCSU, but also their archivist, chronicling the rich history of the West End.
The West End is its own distinct brand of neighborhoods, but it's also sort of a legacy of African-Americans in Charlotte that were displaced from other neighborhoods.
In many ways, he says, this side of the city was a safe haven for some. When areas like Brooklyn were razed by the teeth of urban renewal in the 60s, a process of clearing out what the government defined as slums to make way for better housing and businesses, many of the black people ended up there.
It was devastating. It was devastating. You could see the disappointment in the eyes of the children that had been living there. And, you know, they were over here, but that wasn't by their choice. They were forced.
The plans for the Queen City's growth of her kingdom, though, would also come at the expense of the West End. A growing expressway system, what's now parts of 77 and 277, would tear right through parts of some well-established areas, taking away schools and parks and displacing more than 240 families.
There was nothing about McCrory Heights that was worthy of being destroyed the way it was. I didn't realize that our parents had no power to stop that. I was shocked by that.
At a certain point, people had enough, and times changed as more opportunities opened up for blacks to live elsewhere.
We chose to live in the black community if we wanted to stay here, but a lot of people didn't want to stay here. They moved to other neighborhoods, other parts of town, and they still do.
When you look now, it's evident by the vacant lots and boarded up parts of town that when the money left, sometimes it never returned. That made certain areas void of opportunity and ripe for gentrification.
So not only do you have more white faces here, but you have younger people, millennials, moving into these neighborhoods.
In those places, many with views of uptown, property values have skyrocketed like the rest of Charlotte, pricing out some lifelong residents and creating a barrier of entry for those trying to get in.
I bought 2 lots for about $23,000.
What would those lots go for today?
Those 2 lots are right at about $1 million.
Jatanya Adams is the founder and executive director of the Historic West End Partners, a nonprofit she says is aimed at preserving the culture while still bringing business opportunities back to the Beatties Ford Road corridor, as she says, to ensure what happened in Brooklyn doesn't happen here.
And we wanted to make sure that Black Wall Street was not decimated again and that it was restored.
While Adams does that, at the same time, there's a movement growing to deal with wide-eyed developers who have their eyes on older homes and not so much on respecting the culture of the community.
I don't talk to them. I talk to the neighbors at whose houses they're trying to buy.
What do you tell them?
Tell them, do not sell.
And if they do sell, to make sure those coming in know the history. Simply put, it's a call for the community to take ownership of its past.
Dilworth preserves its history. Park Road preserves its history. Why can't we preserve ours?
In many ways, that's already starting to happen. Grant money is now being used to reconnect the areas 77 tore through. Businesses are also coming back. And so now it's a hope that places like these vacant lots and once bustling places like the Excelsior Club will be restored, so the legacy of the West End is never forgotten.
If we remember our roots, remember who we are, and strive to be a better us, nothing can stand against us.
Janet, the West End isn't the only Charlotte staple that has changed over the years.
That's right, Julian. There's also the Good Samaritan Hospital. It once stood along 800 South Mint Street, what we now know as Bank of America Stadium. Good Samaritan was one of the only black hospitals in North Carolina. It was built in 1891, but unlike other white hospitals in the state, resources and updated medical equipment were few. Lillian Heron was a nurse at Good Sam the same year it sold for just $1.
The only thing that really sort of was disgusting to me was that our black doctors were not up to par as well as they could have been.
In 1996, the building was demolished to make way for Bank of America Stadium. Only a historical marker is left on the grounds to remember Good Sam. Well, still to come, politics in the pulpit. Does the black church still play a key role in shaping policy? We hear from prominent faith leader Pastor Jordan Boyd.
But first, creating meaningful desegregation of schools. Up next, hear the first-hand accounts of those who broke down Charlotte's education barriers in schools and in the courtrooms.
Welcome back. In classrooms and courtrooms, the two are intertwined when it comes to fighting for equity in our schools.
I sat down with two people who fought on the front lines for a fair and quality education for black students.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Separate but equal, or so they said. For more than 100 years, schools in America were segregated based on race. In Charlotte, that was no different. However, in 1954, everything would change with the decision of Brown versus Board of Ed. And although they didn't know it at the time, the Queen City would play a major role in what desegregated schooling would look like post-Brown. But it wouldn't come without a fight.
But it was hard for me to understand that people could treat people that way, the way they treated me.
Over 3 years after the landmark decision, Charlotte would finally integrate. 4 black students enrolling in previously all-white schools. The most famous of them, Dorothy Count Scoggins. The pictures from that day say 1,000 words. Dorothy and family friend Dr. Reginald Hawkins walking heads held high towards Harding High School. A white mob surrounding them, hurling racial slurs and objects in their direction. Almost 70 years later, the memory just as vivid as the day it happened.
There was an adult who was telling the girls to spit on me. How can an adult do that to another individual? And all of that was because my skin was different than theirs.
As Count Scoggins says, her time at Harding was brief. Over a week's time, she would continue to endure hateful comments and looks and people spitting in her food to the point where she had to go home for lunch. But things finally hit ahead.
That was the day that, as I was proceeding to leave, that a blackboard eraser he was hitting the back with a blackboard eraser and a sharp object in the back of my head, standing in the hallway.
That night, her father would call police asking if they could guarantee her safety. When they said they couldn't, the decision was made to pull her out of Harding.
How'd that make you feel?
Well, at first, it made me feel as if I was a failure.
The failure wasn't hers. It was Charlotte's, as many whites in the city fought against something they thought threatened their way of life. But over a decade later, an up-and-coming civil rights attorney by the name of Julius Chambers, along with his team, which included a young James Ferguson, would take that fight to court.
Fortunately, the case was before Judge James McMillan, who himself had no background in desegregation, but was open to listening to the facts of the case. In fact, Judge McMillan used to say that he came to this case not expecting to enter the order that he did.
All I was doing was what I thought the law required and what humanity required.
Swan versus Mecklenburg County built off of the Brown versus Board of Ed ruling. By law, Brown allowed for schools to be desegregated. The question now was how to actually do that. At the time, roughly 14,000 black students attended CMS schools that were at least 99% black. Chambers, along with his team, convinced Judge McMillan the way to fix that was busing.
He recognized that, and he entered an order saying that the same mechanisms that had been used to preserve segregation would have to be used to bring about desegregation.
But just like with Dorothy Count Scoggins at Harding, when a certain way of life was threatened, Charlotte fought back.
I'm full of that. I'll never forget that morning when I got a call from Vivian Chambers, Chambers' wife, saying, Fergie, we just heard the office is on fire.
For Chambers, this was nothing new. His home and car had been bombed before. But now Ferguson saw it firsthand.
Sure enough, the office was up in flames, and my heart just sunk when I saw that. This nice office that Chambers had put together with a contractor here named Malachi Green. And right before my eyes, it was burning down.
Unlike the law office, the Swan ruling would stand, and busing would make Charlotte the model for the South and in many ways the nation for meaningful desegregation of schools. However, not all of Judge McMillan's rulings in Swan were seen through. Part of it called for schools to be built in areas between black and white neighborhoods that would allow for natural desegregation.
But that never became a reality. There may have been one or two midpoint schools that were actually built in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, but for the most part, we have continued to build schools in racially segregated communities.
Busing would end in 2001, the same way it started, by a court order. Since then, Charlotte's schools have, for the most part, resegregated. At Harding High School, where Dorothy Count Scoggins once was the only black face, now there's hardly a white one. Of the 1,234 students enrolled, just 26 identify as white, a sign that those who fought to desegregate say shows plenty of work still needs to be done.
To get to where we are now, my hope is that we will be able to get to where we were before, when children in Charlotte were getting a world-class education.
It's something we have to do if we ever become the nation that we say we are, which is a nation of equality and opportunity for all people. We're not there yet.
From fighting in the classroom to fighting at the polls.
Next, we take a look at the legacy of the black and brown vote in North Carolina. Stay with us.
The legacy of the black vote in North Carolina is rooted in suppression.
Fear, violence, and the court system were pivotal in trying to diminish the black voice. In North Carolina, the roots of suppressing the black vote go back to literacy tests that whites were grandfathered into so long as their relatives had voted at some point prior to the end of the Civil War. Other methods were also used, such as cracking and packing.
Cracking used to describe the way districts were drawn in crooked ways to then pack black and brown voters in them. Racial cartoons were even used as a way to spread misinformation. All of these things were legal, opening up the eyes of a blind Lady Liberty to the true color of Jim Crow America.
And so while we have removed the chains and that we removed the shackles of slavery, the laws replaced them with insurmountable hurdles that were impossible for folks to overcome.
Fast forward to today, some argue the current redistricting and new voter ID requirements in North Carolina are the modern day equivalents of the Jim Crow era voting laws in terms of who they target. A report from the University of Maryland found black and brown people were about twice as likely not to have an ID as their white counterparts.
So how do we make sure black and brown voters show up to the polls? And what's next for the legacy of Black Charlotte?
We're headed to the historic campus of Johnson C. Smith University, where we will be joined by our chief legal correspondent, Khalif Rhodes, for an in-depth conversation with Charlotte Mayor Vi Lyles and other leading voices of our community. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Julian Sador.
I'm Janet Parker.
And I'm Khalif Rhodes.
Up until now, we've talked about the legacy and the history of Black Charlotte.
Now we want to look to the future and how we move that legacy forward.
Joining us are Charlotte Mayor Vi Lyles, CMPD Chief Johnny Jennings, CMS Superintendent Dr. Crystal Hill, Johnson C. Smith President Dr. Valerie Kinlock, and Rockwell AME Zion Church Pastor Jordan Boyd.
We're here in partnership with the historically black Johnson C. Smith University inside the James Smith Memorial Church for a conversation with these leading voices of our community.
We want to thank the JCSU faculty and staff for having us, as well as each of our esteemed panelists for taking the time to be here.
We want to begin with Mayor Lyles. Mayor Lyles, let's talk about Charlotte's identity. It's no secret that Charlotte has become a major transplant city. In the 2040 plan, it lays out what Charlotte will become for the next 20 plus years. Where is Black Charlotte in that plan? And more specifically, has Black Charlotte been lost as the city has continued to grow?
So thank you for that. That's a great question because it comes up often. But I've been in Charlotte a good number of years. And the way that I look at this is that I remember there were a time in the 70s where we would do a study around infrastructure and what was going on. And we were clearly not serving the African American community in a way that we were other communities. And so I think the biggest thing that I would say about that's been most impactful is that the Charlotte City Council has adopted this idea around equity. And equity is written all throughout our 2040 plan. Now, what we have in place that I think I'm most proud of is the corridors of opportunity. Because I remember what LaSalle Street looked like on Beatties Ford Road. I remember the Excelsior and what it was and what a jewel it was. But what has happened is that we have found and identified disinvestment in the past, and we're investing in it today. And that's what is important to us, to build a city around equity and inclusion.
Dr. Kinlock, I want to go to you. JCSU is seen as a gateway to the West End. As JCSU goes, the West End goes. What is being done to ensure that JCSU stays here and thrives so the West End can stay here and thrive?
So Johnson C. Smith University has been here for almost 157 years. And so I want to begin by saying we're not going anywhere. We're here. And so as we think about community engagement, economic development, it's really important for Johnson C. Smith University to play a central role in the relationship with the West End. We're seeking partnerships. We're seeking not just new partnerships, but healing and repairing current partnerships as we think about where we're going with community and not because we're leaving community behind.
Reverend Boyd, I'm a product of the AME Zion Church. I grew up in church, and I can remember any time it was an election season because there would be a white male politician paraded into the church, allowed to come up and speak, basically pitching for the black vote. How important is the black church in campaigning, and is there a place for politics in the pulpit?
Most certainly it is a place for politics in the pulpit, and it is a place where the pulpit, in my opinion, should shape and drive politics because of the essential nature of the black vote. As we sit here in the historic Johnson C. Smith University, it's interesting that the community that once was a predominantly black community is no more. And that's because of many of the elements that have happened around gentrification that has changed how this city looks. And so as the mayor talks about equity, one of the things that we push for as black pastors is not just equity in and throughout the language, but equity in policy. And policy around taxation, policy around rezoning, policy around issues that affect African Americans that are, as we see in the numbers now, being pushed to the fringes of the county and no longer even in the crescent. So the black church is significantly important in helping to raise the level of attention and awareness to the fact that persons who sit in the seat of policy affect the lives of people in both adverse and positive ways.
Dr. Hill, Justice Sotomayor said, if you're black, you're more likely to be in an undersourced school. You're more likely to be taught by teachers who are not as qualified as others. You're more likely to be viewed as having less academic potential. So my question is, what steps are you in the district taking to address what seems to be this new age segregation?
Well, our board has been very clear in making sure that we are running a student outcomes focused governance model, which basically means that the majority of the work that the school board does is focused on outcomes for students. And so just recently, the board adopted new goals. And in that, one of the goals that I am charged with making sure happens is that I'm not neglecting any strategies or resources that would make sure that the most qualified teachers are in front of students that need them the most. And in addition to that, one of the things that I'm tasked with is making sure that I'm eliminating achievement gaps that have persisted for years.
Chief Jennings, I want to come to you. As a black man who is the chief of police, how do you address the scrutiny of your department and officers' treatment of people of color?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's important to me on how we treat everyone within our agency, and I think that's been kind of evident in some of the initiatives that I've taken on early on within the department, particularly with our CMPD Serves customer service program, that we make sure that we are trying to leave those positive impressions, because let's be honest, when you call the police, you're probably having one of your worst days, if not your worst day. And we have to learn to be a part of how do we become the best part of that worst day.
Dr. Hill and Dr. Kinloch, this is for both of you. I recently came across a report that indicated that on average, students will need 4.5 months of instruction on reading and 4 months of instruction on math to catch up for the pre-pandemic achievement levels. And they're calling that the phenomenon of the COVID gap. Considering that the district, for CMS specifically, was already grappling with substantial challenges with closing the gap pre-pandemic with students of color, what goals, what plans do you have in place for dealing with those types of students that have that significant gap? And then when you receive those types of students here and you're noticing those gaps, what are you doing?
So clearly, gaps existed before COVID, and COVID just exacerbated those gaps. So we are taking a look at the data and tracking how students are doing. We're proud in what we're seeing in terms of all students, including students that belong to certain groups, are exceeding expected growth. And so we know that what works, so we're doing everything that we can to accelerate those efforts to close specific gaps. One of the things that we've done, and it actually happened during the pandemic, is we adopted curricula that's culturally responsive, that's focused on grade level standards, and making sure that all students receive a steady diet of on-grade level curriculum. What has happened in the past across many schools in the country is we provide students with lots of interventions. And interventions are important, but if you're not providing students with on-grade level content and access to on-ramp to that on-grade level content, students will always be behind.
Dr. Kinloch, before you jump in there, I'll say this: I appreciate your answer on growth, because over the years I've heard that we've prioritized growth, but I've never heard that second portion in terms of the importance of also giving them a steady diet of on target, because when they get to college, I'm on CPCC's board, and we talk about when students get there, how they're missing some of those things. So Dr. Kinloch, how do you address the gaps that may still be persistent even after they're implementing these numbers.
Absolutely. What Dr. Hill just explained was, in many ways, a really robust and innovative approach to ensuring that students who might not yet be on grade level get on grade level, but also surpass what that grade level is. So the on-ramping is really important. When we get students here at Johnson C. Smith University who might not yet be where they need to be, we provide them with a number of resources. We have 4 colleges here on campus. Each college is charged with ensuring that we have robust curricula that says where are our students in their academic and professional growth, where do they need to go? So from our success coaches to our internship programs that we're growing, to ensuring that every student has access to the types of educational opportunities that they need to not just survive, but to thrive in the world. Beyond Johnson C. Smith University, in the city of Charlotte and across the entire globe.
We want to thank all of our panelists for their answers so far, but coming up next, we're going to give everybody a chance to weigh in on some issues that impact our community as Queen City News continues to present a Black History Month special.
Welcome back. Our next topics are open to the entire panel, so feel free to weigh in. We're in an election year, and there have been a number of talks about redistricting and voter ID laws and voter suppression. How do we ensure that the Black vote and Black individuals get to the polls?
Wow, that is a great question for us because, as you know, in our last election, the turnout was under 5%. And so we have to really begin to mobilize and take action on turning out the vote. I think that we've always relied, as Reverend Boyd said, on the Black church to be able to do this, but that's not enough anymore because we know that there are many people that don't attend churches often and don't really engage in the community. So we have to have targets that we have to develop and act on. So we have to figure out what works to make a woman, a Black woman in our city, come out to vote. Usually it's because they don't make enough money, they don't have child care, they're worried about the next meal. So we've got to develop issues and comments around what we could do to change that for them. Black men, again, they are looking and saying, where are the jobs? Where are the opportunities for us to shine? And so in our community, the city, you call it my community, we look for opportunities to encourage people to apply for the jobs that we have.
Now I'll say this. This is not just because she's an elected official. We had this discussion about asking this question. Back in the 50s and 60s, folks that were in positions of leadership in any capacity kind of helped usher that through.
Yes.
So that's why we thought it was a topic that anybody can jump in, even if you're not an elected official.
Well, I'll just weigh in from a school district standpoint. So it is part of our curriculum to educate our students about government and voting and all of that. So we do have special speakers that come in that talk about the importance of voting, civic engagement. We partner with lots of organizations, but we also actually provide voter registration cards to our students so they can go ahead and get registered to vote. So when it's time for them and when they turn 18, they can participate.
The district is really an important site and partner. The city, of course, is as well. And when we think about universities, especially historically Black colleges and universities, we have to also think about the responsibility that we have to not just educate the students who are on campus or who walk through our gates. We have a moral and ethical responsibility to ensure that people understand civic engagement, as our superintendent expressed. And we also have to understand that students have to be involved. So from teaching them in classrooms about their human rights and civil rights to saying, how can we be a site in and for this community to ensure that our students are registered, our students understand civic engagement, and our students become responsible global citizens of the world. And that requires us to use the university as a site and a space that welcomes people in so we can get the vote out.
I do want to ask for each of you, aside from your positions when you may be at the university, superintendent, mayor, chief of police, faith-based leader, what are we seeing in the community? Because obviously who you are extends past when you leave the campus or wherever you may work. People listen to what you have to say. What are we seeing in the communities, people when we're at lunch, dinner, casual conversations, to encourage our people to show up at the polls?
I think that people forget the power of what the vote is and the struggles that people before us went through so that we can have that privilege to go out and vote. And I know for me all the time we get questions about what are we doing in the community for policing to help keep our community safe, and Chief, why don't you stop doing X, Y, Z because this is even though it's a law, why are you enforcing this? And a lot of times I do have answers that say this is something that needs to be through legislation, something that you vote your elected officials into office so that they can make those decisions. And that's important. And if it means that much to our community, then that's where you got to put the right people in the right places to make those decisions that affect not just policing, but affect our entire society.
There is a disconnect, I've found, between the voter and the impact of the vote. And what I mean by that is that when I talk to my 31, 29-year-old who grew up in an engaging household, they still want to know, why should I vote for this person and what difference does it make? And so the ability to articulate by the elected officials and by pastors and clergy how this person voting on particular issues will drive change that will affect them individually. I think probably one of the greatest things that's going to be on the national ballot is women's rights, reproductive rights. Women can clearly identify with that vote and the impact of that vote for certain persons who are going to be elected. To be able to do that and articulate that in a way that helps the individual see that my voting for this person will affect me, my income, where I live, my neighbors, my health care, my education, is something that we have to do a better job articulating.
I think one of the things from my reporting on this series and talking to people who have spent their entire life in Charlotte is that Charlotte, unfortunately, has an ugly history of racism. We've come a long way from that, as evidenced by the positions that you all hold, but there's still plenty of work to do. What can we be doing to combat racism today?
If you go back and look at that Eastover area, you'll find deed restrictions that are since been outlawed, but the neighborhood is still 99% white. The education level of one side of the street is very different from the other side of the street. So policy, I think partnerships with education, with HBCUs, but also bringing the kinds of alignment with career and education to address some of the racial disparities that have happened over the years. I think that there should be some intentionality as it relates to contracting, as it relates to protection of neighborhoods that are at risk of being gentrified, that have had to bear the brunt of policies that have displaced African American residents over the years. And that takes a political will and courage that we are still struggling to find.
Reverend Boyd has said a lot about what we need to do, and it is all accurate and true. I think sometimes we depend on government for too many things, that we have the ability to actually repair and do those things that we have the authority to do. And sometimes authority isn't enough, just not enough. When we talk about what's going on in our community around gentrification, it would be great if I could, as mayor, sign a document that says private equity firms are not allowed in this neighborhood. But this country has dealt with race in many different ways and many different levels. And we have to find ways to be diligent, to change the policies, but we also have to determine how we can make a difference and what's really workable and effective. So I think the best thing about Charlotte is that we have partners that do this with us. We have the universities, we have the school systems, we have people that are committed to this. But I also think that it is important for us to set some parameters for what we ought to do, especially around how we spend tax dollars.
I got a follow-up question for a number of things that Mayor Lyles and Chief Jennings talked about. In the wake of George Floyd, we marched in the street with a number of black leaders. Mm-hmm. I marched with both of you that day. And there are a number of policies that were, brought out after that. What are some things that still can be worked on in terms of bridging the gap between policing and the community, but just holistically, like for wiping out some of the systemic issues that still seem to be present even a number of years after we marched?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that we have to do within our agency is the knowledge, the history that we see within policing is not something that we're proud of, right? So one of the things I do when we talk about the people that we're hiring, they go to the Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro. Every single recruit that comes through, we do a bus tour down there with each class. And I think that's important because we have to understand why there might be mistrust within policing, because you're not talking about too far away. You're talking a couple of generations. Somebody's grandmother tells their grandkid what happened to them, or grandfather saying, that's not too far removed from where we are today. And so if you can understand the history, then maybe you understand that how can we become more empathetic towards those that we come in contact with on an everyday basis. And like I said, how do we be the best part of someone's worst day without thinking that they deserve what's happened to them, or that that's just part of the culture that they live in? And we have to be responsive to that in policing.
The chief has done a tremendous job for our community, and he has taken an approach to look at it from the other side. And that makes all the difference. So for example, is homelessness really a crime? Or is homelessness just a situation that you're not able to deal with, you haven't determined how to go about it? So these issues are very deep. They require a lot of analysis and a lot of willpower for the community, as well as all of us that sit here that participate in establishing that kind of, what do we do next? How do we make it better? Question.
And if I can add in, how do we also unlearn the things that we might have already learned, that we actually engage in, that's not right, that's not based in a justice framework? I think one of the big things when we talk about how to eradicate racism, or what else can we do after the murder of Mr. George Floyd Jr., is to think about not just tweaking policy, but training people who understand how to write and propose equitable policies in different areas, whether we are talking about in policing, whether we're talking about for city government or council, whether we're talking about for people going into schools to be teachers and superintendents, whether we're talking about leaders who will be university presidents. We need people who are trained to understand what equity is and how to use an equity framework to create new policies that are equitable for all people. We will never eradicate racism, particularly in this country, if we do not create equitable policies. And in so doing, we have to ask ourselves fundamental questions. Who's represented in the room and who isn't? Who gets a right to speak and who doesn't? Who, at the end of the day, gets to walk into a community and say, I'm going to gentrify it or not?
Dr. Kinlock, that was well said, and I believe it's going to take all of us here, especially everybody up here, to play a role in eradicating racism and making this a better place for us all. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. A lot of states are addressing diversity and inclusion on the academic side, so I had to ask both of you, Dr. Hill and Dr. Kinlock, what steps are you doing to ensure that your university and your district is in compliance or in front of whatever diversity and inclusion efforts are coming down the road?
The first thing that I would say is that we just have to be really intentional in making sure that we're protecting history, including all history, our history. And I think the other thing that's important to note is that it's really important for us in terms of as an employers, when we have adults in front of children, to understand the history specifically of our city. So one of the things that we just recently did last week actually with our executive team is we participated in a bus tour, learned all about the redlining, different neighborhoods, because we have new people on our team that aren't from the Charlotte area. And so, you understand, you hear these terms, but to actually see how it has impacted Charlotte is critically important. And we've decided that that is now going to be a part of our onboarding process for all of our leaders in our district.
I would simply add in, it's interesting that we sit here in 2024 still talking about the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've always talked about these things, whether we name them multicultural education or living in a diverse society, whether we're saying it's diversity or inclusion. We've always had these conversations, and it's the way things get named and renamed and repackaged that is really problematic for me. I would say, as a university, really as a human being who is in the world, we cannot ever not talk about, if there is anything, being a Black woman who is in the South, how can we not talk about diversity? The thing that we have to do differently is to have strategies for how we invite people into these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how we don't have to be combative. Diversity is not a bad thing. But if we don't understand what diversity, inclusion, and equity are, then it becomes the thing that we don't want to talk about.
Finally, I'll say, we're here, we're talking about legacy. Part of this special is about the legacy of what Charlotte has been in your respective roles. What does Charlotte's legacy look like in the future?
We've got to address the problems of today. We've got to address the problems that we've all described in our conversations, and we know that these are real. But I also like to think about our city as a place that openly understands that there are problems and talks about them openly. We wouldn't be having this kind of discussion and bearing so many things that really are so real and crucial to what is possible for a city and what is impossible for some parts of our city that don't really work that way.
My hope is that 25, 30 years from now, that you're going to have leaders sitting at the table that are going to look back and say, they really put us in a good position to be able to thrive as a city. And that they look at the work that's being done now, and they know that it's going to propel Charlotte even greater than where we are today. I think this is the greatest city in the country. We have, it's just a fantastic place to live. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But I also want to see us progress as we continue to move forward. I think we've made strides. I don't think we can sit back and say we've not done anything. But in 25, 30 years, I want them to look back and be proud of the work that we've done right now.
I'll say, if you go back 20 to 30 years, people would be amazed at what we're doing right now.
Absolutely.
And the fact that we're here, Johnson C. Smith having this panel discussion, it's going to be broadcast on TV. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their day to have these important discussions. I'd like to thank Johnson C. Smith for having us. Dr. Kinloch, thank you so much. And with that, we'll be right back.
We hope you've enjoyed the past hour of stories and conversation about the legacy of Black Charlotte.
And we hope that you continue to share our stories and have these conversations in your homes and in your community. I'm Julian Sador.
And I'm Janet Parker. On behalf of Queen City News, thank you for watching and for honoring Black History Month.